Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's briefing at the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Dekel. This Friday, the International Court of Justice delivered its order on the provisional measures submitted by South Africa, which argue that Israel's military actions in Gaza constitute a violation of its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention. To discuss the proceedings and what we may see until the next milestone in February, when Israel must present a report over measures taken to abide by the provisional measures, is Ambassador Daniel Taub, Israel's former envoy to Great Britain and a renowned international legalist. Taub himself represented Israel before the UN Investigative Committee for the Flotilla incident in 2010. Thank you very much for being with us, Ambassador Taub, and especially on such short notice.
It's a pleasure, Talia.
So Israel traditionally doesn't appear in front of international courts. Why did it choose to cooperate this time?
So a tribunal like this, or a legal hearing, usually presents Israel with something of a dilemma. On the one hand, Israel wants to have the opportunity to make its case. But on the other hand, often we see that this is the result of political pressures. It's not really a legal proceeding, it's a political proceeding. And we don't really want to give legitimacy to a proceeding that isn't a proper legal proceeding. So we're torn. So you remember 20 years ago, there was a hearing before the same court in The Hague on the issue of our security fence, but it was very clearly politically motivated. Israel decided not to participate. It wasn't a party to the proceedings and so on. In this particular case, it's a little different because the proceeding arises from an unusual jurisdiction, what's called the jurisdiction of the International Court that arises out of the Genocide Convention. And Israel was one of the first parties to the Genocide Convention. It's obviously within the DNA of Israel. And that's the reason why Israel, first of all, considered it was bound, and secondly, thought it was very important to state its case, which is why this time it found itself making its case, at least at this stage of proceedings before the court.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain perhaps the significance of the judgment on provisional measures for those of us less versed in international law?
Sure. First of all, Talia, forgive me for at this age, we're not talking about a judgment, and that actually has a legal significance. We're talking about a ruling or a decision. And it's something that's a little bit unusual about the proceedings of the court in relation to the Genocide Convention, which is that even before it gets to discuss the merits, the substance of the allegations of genocide, which will happen in a few months' time and may take months or even years, and even before it actually rules on whether it even has jurisdiction, because genocide is such a potentially terrible thing, it can have an early stage proceeding of what are called provisional measures. And the argument in this case is that was made by South Africa. If a genocide is happening, then we need to have provisional measures issued by the court already at this early stage. So that was the purpose of this. South Africa, which is really an accomplice of Hamas in this particular type of proceeding, was pushing very hard to tie Israel's hands. The real upshot of the measures that it was looking for was that Israel would not be able to continue with its operations to defend itself in the Gaza Strip. And I think from Israel's perspective, the most significant finding of the court is that there is no restriction on Israel's lawful defense within the Gaza Strip. In fact, implicit in the court's decision is that Israel can continue to defend itself within the Gaza Strip in accordance with international law. That's something that Israel accepts. And obviously, in defending itself, it cannot try and commit anything remotely like a genocide, which is what South Africa was trying to argue. There were a series of provisional measures that were issued. We can go through them. I think it's fair to say that all of them are things that Israel accepts. So Israel was being ordered to do something, to act in accordance with international law, to provide for the access of humanitarian assistance as far as is possible, to prevent statements to incitement to genocide, and so on and so forth. So Israel found itself in the unusual situation of being ordered to do certain things, which it's already, by its own law and by its own statements, committed to doing.
Right, committed to doing, and even so, there's a just the show, just the fact that Israel was being accused of these things, I think is safe to say certain damage was done to Israel. A question on one of the sources that has been used, the court using its using reports from various UN agencies, including UNRWA, which just this weekend suffered a significant blow to its credibility, specifically regarding its own conduct in the war and the conduct of many of its staff members. Do you think that these testimonies will continue to be accepted by the relevant players? Can anything be changed when the proceedings have already begun?
So first of all, just to pick up on something that you said, Tanya, I think you're absolutely right that although the ruling was one that I think was a definite loss to South Africa and its accomplices, reputationally, to even see a situation where Israel is in the defendant's seat for the crime of apartheid, even if this is entirely thrown out as it should be when it comes to it, and particularly in a situation when the people of Israel are on the receiving end of attacks by a genocidal jihadist organization, is something that is shocking and is reputationally very, very, very damaging. I think there is a challenge. It's not just in the decision of the court. If you look at the submission that was made by South Africa to the court, the 84 pages, and you look at the footnotes, there's a sort of little incestuous circle of UN bodies that are all quoting each other with facts and figures that really have very little independent verification. Yes, it is to be hoped that this will be something of a wake-up call. You know, tragically, the time frame doesn't always work out to Israel's advantages. We have these processes going on in real time when very often the actual facts and figures take a long time to verify. You know, one of the disadvantages, as you well know, Talia, is that you know, often the people on the other side, Hamas and its spokespeople, will be coming out with allegations instantly, whereas the Israeli Defense Forces are committed to investigating properly. And by the time that the actual results come out, it's too late for the news cycle. So the hope is that it will be clearer now that frequently the UN and other agencies are complicit in spreading atrocity propaganda, and sometimes, as in the case of UNRWA, even worse, actually being complicit in some of the acts themselves. And hopefully that will encourage people to take pause.
Right. Well, we did see several countries even freezing their funds to the organization over the weekend. We had our own judge from Israel, Justice Aaron Barak, who was appointed, of course, to participate. And he actually voted in favor of the order that Israel must take steps against incitement to genocide and to provide aid to Gaza. Do you think this came as a surprise to our defense in any way?
I'm not sure. I think the appointment of Justice Barak was interesting and very significant. I mean, for a start, I think he was the only judge, and he actually makes reference to this in his dissenting judgment. He was the only judge on the panel to actually be a survivor of genocide. He is himself a Holocaust survivor. And I think this gives him particular moral weight. Beyond that, he's not just an international lawyer of great standing, but he has personally been involved in many decisions of Israel's Supreme Court, and he describes some of them in his judgment, where they've sent the military back to the drawing board because they consider that some of its plans or its policies don't meet with international law. So in a sense, he's a model of what genuine legal supervision, oversight over armed conflict can actually look like. I think that's very significant indeed. In practice, his dissenting opinion is very clear on the fact that he thinks it's the allegation of genocide and genocidal intent against Israel is outrageous. But he did say that he supports, and again, he's in agreement with Israel on this. He did support the call for Israeli officials to be careful in their language and not use language that can be interpreted as a call to genocide or anything similar, and also to continue its efforts to try and make sure that humanitarian access gets to the people of Gaza. Though, as we know, one of the challenges is that humanitarian access is frequently hijacked by Hamas and other terrorist groups. So on those two things, he actually sided with the majority of the judges. We should also mention, just in passing, that there was another judge, the Ugandan judge, Julia Sebutindi, who dissented from the judges on all of the issues, including those two. She thought that this was, in many ways, an outrageous proceeding. And she placed it in a broader context of what you might call lawfare. She thought this is an attempt by one side to a conflict to try and advance their interests in the conflict using legal tools, and she's absolutely categorical. This is not the way to bring peace between the two sides. So I think that's quite an important statement as well.
Does Israel have any tools to actually implement the prevention of statements being made by its politicians?
So the answer is that we do. We have a department in the Ministry of Justice that is charged with preventing incitement, not just by political officials, by anybody in the system. It's done it in the past. Within Israel, we have people who have been charged and put on trial and punished for statements. But it's a tough call. You need to make sure that you're not punishing people for emotive statements said in the heat of the moment that didn't have any practical intent at all. And that's something that there are already processes, and it may be that as a result of this decision, there'll be more of a spotlight placed on them.
So sorry to kind of be going into politics, but one journalist is asking whether you believe that the members of this current government are capable of keeping those comments to themselves, or considering the nature of this coalition, will they continue to make the same mistakes?
So it's very hard for me to say. I do think in some ways, not just this judgment, but the discussion around it has been a little bit of a wake-up call that sometimes things that are said in an emotive way, emotional statements in the heat of grief, in the heat of anger in the face of a terrorist attack, have consequences beyond what the people making them consider that they are. I think it's challenging because when we saw in the South African submission, they were not simply quoting people in the chain of command who are obviously relevant. They were quoting people from anywhere they could find, including TV personalities, singers, and goodness knows what. I think the notion that the government is going to be able to control, and you wouldn't want to limit freedom of speech in that way, but certainly those people who have authority, those people who find themselves in the chain of command, I think this is a reminder that we have a responsibility, not just in relation to the way that we act, but in the relation to the way that we speak as well.
Right. Well, not everyone is as eloquent as you, Ambassador. Just give me 1 second. Sorry.
Sure, thank you.
Apologies. What do you expect that we will see from Israel's report at the end of next month?
So I should note, just for the record, that Israel hasn't yet made a formal decision on whether it's going to submit a report. Just for the journalists here, we should point out that there were a couple of other measures that we haven't mentioned so far. Let me first of all mention, to my mind, a very important one. Although obviously the South Africans didn't ask for it, there was a measure, an order made that said that Israeli hostages held in Gaza need to be released immediately and unconditionally. And I think that's a very important statement from the International Court, recognizing that the abduction and the holding in captivity of these people is a fundamental violation of international law. And obviously our hope is that will help bring pressure to bear on the people who are holding Hamas and the other groups, and the people that have an influence on them, which, by the way, should include South Africa. Beyond that, there's another provision, another measure that was issued, which called on Israel to provide a report within 1 month on the steps that it is taking in order to comply with the order. I think in practice, that shouldn't be difficult because there's nothing in the orders that Israel isn't committed to anyway. But because of the political implications of continuing to cooperate with the court, I imagine that will be a decision that will be made by the political level.
Does that open the door for perhaps a ruling that will essentially say that we're not upholding these measures?
I think we are likely to see the continuation of these proceedings in one way or another through a number of different tracks. We shouldn't forget that in a few months' time, we haven't seen the timetable yet. The court is due to hold a hearing on the substance of the matter. And I think it's also fair to say, although I've presented this as, in a sense, as a ruling that is a failure for South Africa, in the sense that it didn't tie Israel's hand, we should point out that the court did not dismiss this entire proceeding. It didn't strike it from the list, which is one of the things that Israel was asking for. Israel was hoping that there would be a finding that this is such an outrageous allegation that the court should strike it from its docket. I think it's fair to say that it's very unusual for any court in the world to find that it doesn't have jurisdiction in a matter. So in theory, we are in an environment where there could be subsequent rulings.
And how are other democracies watching all of this unfold, supposed to, view what's going on? What does it say about the state of international law, in your opinion?
I think that's a very important question, Talia, because I think it's not just Israel that is on trial here. In a way, it's international law that is on trial. The question is, does international law give law-abiding countries tools with which they can lawfully confront terrorist groups that are adopting these kind of cynical tactics? And I think if the court were to have found that there was genocide, were to have tied Israel's hands, were to have insisted on a ceasefire, then first of all, democracies around the world would have had enormous frustrations, would have wondered, why should we hold ourselves to international law? Is it some kind of suicide pact, particularly when they know, as many militaries have said, that a lot of the measures that are being taken by Israel to hold itself back, to warn people, to hold off attacks for 2 weeks, to allow people to evacuate, are things that in many instances they might not do themselves. And the other people that are watching this are terrorist organizations around the world. And if they were to see that these tactics are effective, then as with other tactics that started our region, we would be likely to see these surfacing in other arenas as well. So we would see terrorist groups embedding themselves in the heart of civilian areas and using the same cynical tactics. So I think international law is on trial. So far, even though the jury is still out, attempts to tie the hands of democracies fighting against terrorism have been pushed back by the court in this decision. And I think that's very important.
Knesset member Gideon Sal suggested that Israel should take Iran to court at the ICJ for calling and working for the destruction of Israel, which might be a little bit easier to prove. Is this something that is feasible? And why isn't Israel doing this thus far?
So I can't speak for the political echelon at the moment. I think it's absolutely clear that Iran deserves to be on the defendant's bench far, far more than Israel or almost any other country. So if we have confidence that the makeup of the court is one that can reach an effective decision, then I think it really does behold on us to use all of the measures at our disposal. And I, for one, personally, would be very, very happy to see Iran and other accomplices to terror on the defensiveness for their support, training, active sort of financial support, and their direct involvement in acts of terrorism against us, not just from Gaza, but on many different fronts.
Very clear. One journalist is first stating, or rather asking, whether the rulings themselves are binding in any way and what impact a ruling either way will have on Israel's decision-making, operationally or otherwise.
So formally, rulings or provisional measures are binding. That doesn't mean that they're always complied with. I think Russia is a very good example of a country that has had rulings or provisional measures issued by the court and has failed to comply with them. I think in this case it's hypothetical because there aren't any measures that have been issued by the court that Israel has any disagreement with. All of the points that have been made by the court are areas of principle that Israel agrees with and has mechanisms to implement. And if Israel isn't fulfilling them, first and foremost, that's a problem within Israel, and we have our own measures for trying to bring ourselves into compliance.
And I'll ask a follow-up question. In terms of the credibility that Israel's system currently has, do you think that the judicial reform prior to the war damaged Israeli judicial credibility in any way and its ability to investigate its own incidents?
It's hard for me to say. I think it is significant that just a couple of weeks ago we had a decision by the Supreme Court that was actually pushing back at the first and so far only element of that judicial reform that had actually been imposed, and actually undid the legislation on the issue of reasonableness. I think the fact that the current government agreed to the appointment of Justice Barak to be its ad hoc judge on the panel, I think also sent a message that we take pride in the independence of our Supreme Court. Again, I refer people to the dissenting judgment of Justice Barak, in which he gives a number of very practical examples of the way in which the Israeli Supreme Court has held both the government and the military to international legal standards. And I know from my own experience as an international lawyer that not only are these decisions often quoted by other legal systems around the world, the system itself is held in genuinely high regard.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but I do want to bring you to the point that you've mentioned a few times about the fact that we're always looking at the political context of these developments. What is the significance of South Africa bringing this case against Israel in the first place? And what does this mean about future relations with this country?
So South Africa, sadly, currently has a government which sees itself as being an active accomplice and supporter of Hamas. That predated, the atrocities of October the 7th. It was already hosting Hamas leaders. Shockingly, after October the 7th, but before any response by Israel, it was congratulating Hamas leaders. It was sending its own leaders to Tehran. It was already blaming Israel before Israel had done any kind of response whatsoever. So I think its political involvement here is sadly very obvious, and also sadly it's not the first time that that South Africa has been an accomplice or a cover-up for a genocide, not just the Hamas genocide, but we know that it itself was in violation of an order from the International Criminal Court when it hosted Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, in relation to the genocide that was committed in Darfur. Israel, has in the past had good relations with South Africa. It hopes for good relations with South Africa, but with the current government that has decided to see itself as a champion of these terrorist organizations, it's hard to know how to progress those in the current climate.
All right, I promised the last question, but one just came in regarding our northern front. Do you think that these proceedings, which could take some time, according to current estimates, might impact Israel's decision making with regards to a war that it may or may not have to conduct in the northern border?
It's hard for me to say, but if I think about the bottom line, is the bottom line of the ruling so far is that Israel is allowed to defend itself from threats to its citizens, as long as it does that in accordance with international law. That has been Israel's position all along. I think that same calculus applies in relation to the northern border. There's obviously a very complicated, sensitive political debate to be had. But the notion that we have on our northern border another Iranian proxy, better armed, 150,000 or more precision missiles, and sadly, better trained troops, and so on and so forth, whatever it is needed in order for us to enable the 100,000 evacuees from the north to return to their homes, that's going to be a very complicated decision. But I think at root, the balance between self-defense and holding ourselves to international law is something that's going to apply on every front.
Very clear. Ambassador Daniel Taub, thank you so much for your time, and may we have a quiet week.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everybody.